me a little tomorrow. Okay, so I don't know why I'm not on the speaker view. Maybe if Deb. Okay, I'll spotlight for everyone. There we go. Maybe you can see me now. So we had an interlude last week from our live online studies, and I provided a little, was it 10-minute, 12-minute video? I'm not going to ask how many of you watched it. No show of hands, no embarrassment, whether you did or whether you didn't. So those of you who did will have got a bit of a feel for Nehemiah chapter 5, on a chapter that itself, as we took a break, is chronologically something of a break, something of an interlude from the work of building the walls that dominates the narrative from chapter 3 onwards. Okay, so I don't know if you picked up on this, perhaps in the video you wouldn't necessarily, or in your own reading of chapter 5. Don't worry if you're not too familiar with it. We're going to go through it a little bit this evening. We're not going to skip it. But one of the things that you could entitle this chapter is Welcome to a Lesson on Economics, which is about as attractive as, I don't know, gout. I don't know, economics is not the sort of thing that excites me, if I'm honest. But that's perhaps one of the main themes in chapter 5. Perhaps more specifically, you could say, welcome to a lesson on social and economic justice, because that would be very much part of the theme of Nehemiah 5. And they're big themes. So let's warm up to it with a very brief recap on the story so far, and I'm going to hand over to Sandra Russell, who's going to give us that. No, I'm not. I'm only joking, Sandra. But having read all credit to Sandra. She's up to speed with the text. She's read the passage, and that's really good. So you're in a good position. So let me just share my screen for a second, and I'll pop up a couple of slides that you'll be familiar with. Although I have tweaked them a little bit, so keep your eyes open. It's not all the same as to what you've seen before. So we're building back better. So we're in the first half of Nehemiah, this big first 7 chapters, which with an emphasis on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Just have a little glance at that map while I talk for a moment. So basically, where are we so far? All the citizens of Jerusalem are mucking in, whatever their professions, with some wall building, because Nehemiah, official to the king of Persia, had arrived in Jerusalem and was spurring them on to build this wall. Because, well, the king of Persia allowed, we might in fact say enabled him, with appropriate support and resources to go to Jerusalem. Because Nehemiah had prayed that the king of heaven would give the king of Persia a sympathetic ear to his request. He prayed. Why did he pray? He prayed because he was distressed. He was upset. Chapter 2, verse 2 says he was sad, and it could be seen in his face, in his demeanor. Why? Well, because he had heard that the people, his people, were in great trouble and disgrace, and the walls and gates of the city were in a state. Why did he hear this? Well, because Hanani, that's a guy that appears in the very first book of this book of Nehemiah, Hanani, came to Susa, which was about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem, to where the king and Nehemiah were. So the map in front of you, you can see there, you can see Susa right in the middle, and you can see Jerusalem off to the left there. And this is a picture of the Persian, or the Medes and Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was a little bit smaller by this stage, but pretty much covered most of that area. And as you can see, it stretched as far east as India and as far west as, well, certainly Jerusalem, and through into northern Africa, including parts of northern Ethiopia. And why had Hanani traveled to Susa, this 1,000-mile journey? Well, we don't know. It was possibly because he was on business, possibly because he was seeking out Nehemiah. Either way, he was carrying the news and the burden of the state of play in Jerusalem. So he traveled all the way east to pass this message, deliver this message to Nehemiah. So everyone is mucking in to build back better, the place where they called home. I think I might have another map here. There we go. So Nehemiah journeys from Susa to Jerusalem, and it's a long journey. Where is Susa today? Well, I don't know if you are good with your geography and good with your maps, but basically Susa there on the right hand side of the screen is in Iran. Did you get that right? It's basically modern day Iran, and traveled all the way from Iran over towards Jerusalem in the west. Well, everybody was mucking in, and there was a sense of thrill and excitement. A nice story, if you like. You could even say a safe story, a children's tale. And yet, I'd want to say that this is a sort of story that you shouldn't put on before the watershed. It should only appear after 9 p.m. Because if you think it's just a nice, simple and safe children's story, you're missing a vital component in the whole story. If you don't spot the growing jeopardy, which starts right back in chapter 2 and intensifies through to chapter 7, then you've missed an undertone in the book. And that undertone are the threats and the opposition that Nehemiah and the people have to face. So there's my little summary. You can see it on the screen. Chapter 1, he gets a report. Chapter 2 reviews the situation. Chapter 3, the repairs get underway. And chapter 4, there is a threat from outside opponents, non-Jews. So you've got Sanballat in the north, Tobiah in the east, Geshem in the south, and the Ashdodites in the west. And I heard the word Ashdodite on the news recently when I was listening to the rather sad and tragic developments that were taking place in Israel and the Gaza Strip over the last couple of weeks. And there was a mention of Ashdod as a city that's still in that part of the world. Anyway, you've seen that screen, and that's going back too far. But chapter 4 has threats from outside. Chapter 5, the threats are from within, from inside. And this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time this evening. Now, some of you might think, hang on a minute, I bothered to watch the video that you put out, and I've read chapter 5, and I thought we were moving on. Well, I hope that we will cover some of chapter 6. But actually, chapter 5 is quite important, and chapter 6 sort of repeats in a developmental way some stuff that's already happened. So we don't need as much time in chapter 6, but we do need a little bit of time in chapter 5. So we're going to look at it like this. Firstly, verses 1 to 5, the complaints that Nehemiah heard in verses 1 to 5. So I'm going to read verses 1 to 5, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it can be just a little bit irritating when you can't see the speaker. I know. Okay, still with me? Still got thumbs up? Excellent. Okay, so Bible's open, verses 1 to 5 of chapter 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." There's great distress here. There's an outcry of grief over the economic state that they were now in. Economic hardship for most, although not for everyone. There were some who profiteered, if you like, in this challenging situation. And we never like that, do we? It happens even in our day. Arguably, it's happened in the last year to 15 months during this rather significant development that we've been living through. And we don't like it, do we? When a few people seem to profit while others face struggles. It just feels unjust. And so the cry came both from those in Jerusalem, the Jerusalemites, for want of a better description, having to temporarily give up their normal work. There were also an outcry from those outside the city. Others, verse 3, who were experiencing a measure of famine, and those who had to sell their labor to other families, and in fact graphically portrayed as selling their sons and daughters, which was probably a measure of slavery within that, also a measure of employment, very different employment types of arrangements in those days. Normally you would simply work for yourselves and your own family, and to work for another family felt like enslavement and didn't sit easily with them. And it's easily conceivable that the economic pressure caused by the building program that we celebrate in chapter 3, in which most normal income would have been suspended, brought about this underlying difficulty, such that Nehemiah needs to take urgent action. Perhaps he realized that diverting manpower from raising crops to raising walls may have been the burden that broke the economic back of the country. After all, the walls might be good, but you can't eat walls, and people need to eat to live. There were certainly some hidden strains within the community, perhaps masked by the concerted building effort. So that's the first point, really, the complaints that Nehemiah heard. Let me see if I can share my screen again. I trust that I'm still got you all with me. There we go. So, and then let's go to verses 6 to 13. 6 to 13, I won't read these, but do glance down at them. This is the steps that Nehemiah took in response to the complaints that he heard. Glance down at them and you'll see that he is a man of passion. He gets steamed up about the injustice that he hears of. And after he hears the protests and finds the anger rising within him, you can almost hear him saying, stay cool, think this through. Despite his seeming anger, he is self-controlled enough to realize that he needs to think before he speaks. We've got a long way to go to learn that lesson, haven't we? Well, perhaps some of us longer than others, but it's a lesson that we always need to learn. But he calls the community together. Spot that in verse 7. Yeah. After all, there's a community problem and it's a community issue. And so he calls the community together, or at least the leaders of the community. Some were seeking to profit from the economic downturn, the heads and overseers, as they're referred to here, attaching conditions to loans that would benefit them and cripple others. These are the original loan sharks, to be honest. You know, they're people who see a need, offer a solution, but only in a way that very much profits themselves. There we go. So, and then in verse 14, we get the next section, which is the example that Nehemiah set. And so I will read these few verses from verses 14 to 19, the example that Nehemiah set. So here we go. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them, in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. This is the example that Nehemiah set. What does it sound like to you? What does it feel like to you to read this? Well, from a position of relative comfort and authority, it would be easy for him not to feel the effects of the economic hardship and invite people to simply work harder, spend less, save better, get a second job, get on your bike. All phrases that, well, they feel like a stab in the side to those who are on the receiving end of them, especially those for whom the system is against. And sadly, those phrases are still used today. But Nehemiah is not just a wise leader, but he's also a better person than that. And so he actively implements practices that will benefit others whilst costing him, lending people grain and silver, money effectively, and not charging interest, or at least not a penalizing level of interest. So let's look at some of these little details in this section, shall we? So here we learn for the first time his official status as governor. First time it mentions that. You see that in verse 14, I hope. And you see the length of time in which he served this first term as governor, effectively from 445 BC to 433 BC. So it's 12 years. It says 12 years in the passage. You haven't got to work it out. You're told it. And what we have here is a catalogue of achievements as governor against the background of the exorbitant demands normally made of a man in his position, as the former governors had done. He says, he contrasts himself, doesn't he, in verse 15. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people, blame the people that went before. That's classic modern day politics, but that's not what's happening here. He's genuinely doing things differently and being a different person. And so the contrast between him and those who'd gone before, you see in verse 16, really, and Nehemiah and his servants had taken their full share in the rebuilding program. They were getting their hands as dirty as everybody else. They weren't saying, oh, somebody's got to manage the situation. Somebody's got to do the paperwork. Somebody's got to, sit in the office and, polish the photocopier. None of those sort of, excuses. They were getting their hands dirty. They were getting involved with the people involved in the program. And indeed, it wasn't just measuring up on a sort of an equality basis with the people, but also using his position to perhaps demonstrate generosity. So, for example, in verse 17, it talks there about this meal. 150 Jews and officials ate at my table. Well, he was fortunate enough as governor to be in a position where he could invite 150 plus people to a meal. He extended generosity, not overly ostentatious, but generosity nevertheless, out of his own pocket, or at least out of his own allowance. Is probably how I would prefer to see it. And all these things, each day, an ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, which perhaps sounds a little bit over the top. It's not what your average Jerusalemite would have been eating for lunch every day. So he is in a very blessed position. But it is in a sense well, actually, if you read the history back in 1 Kings chapter 4, there's an account there of Solomon's household. Great King Solomon. Well, he was pretty ostentatious and enjoyed the finer things of life, you might say. And there's a record there of what ought to be provided to the governor, and these things listed here are sort of the equivalent, really, of what was provided to those who governed in this place at this time. And so he's living within the normal standard of living, if you like, of his governor, and yet using it to bless others by inviting them for meals and sharing his wealth. And he wanted the people to remember these acts, and he wanted God to remember them too. It says that in verse 19, because God's verdict was all important to him. What was his motive for doing these things, for being a good governor rather than a bad governor? Is it because he wanted to be liked? It was nice to be nice. Well, no, his motive is very clear, and it's in verse 15, and it ought to be our motive for what we do too. Verse 15, do you see it there? Their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. It was out of reverence for God that he acted in the way that he did, not lording it over others, as he says, and as somebody else said some generations later. You might remember the Lord Jesus having a few words to say to those people who ruled at his time, of lording it over others. Lording it over has never been a good thing. And there was also a second motivation as well, not just out of reverence for God, which is very clear and specific and evident there in verse 15. But there was also, I think, a second motivation. There was a heart of compassion. He was a compassionate socialist. And I don't mean that politically. What I mean is there was a social compassion about his actions. He was aware of what was going on in society, and he was compassionate about it. So, for example, I get that in verse 18, where it says he knew the demands were heavy on the people. He knew what was going on. He wasn't blind or unaware or unaffected. He didn't have his head in the sand, or his his world didn't function around what do they call the Westminster bubble. He didn't live in the Westminster bubble, where people accuse politicians of not knowing what's going on in the real world, in real people's lives. He knew what was going on, and he knew that the demands were heavy on the people. When we see other people burdened, our heart goes out to them, doesn't it? All of us on the screen here, we've been Christians for years. If I totted up the number of years that were represented by people on the screen this evening, well, it would go into the hundreds, and it would be a source of rejoicing, really. The faithfulness that's available to be seen amongst all of us, and more importantly, not what we've done, as the song said, that we started with, but what he has done In other words, he has enabled us to remain faithful, and he has kept us in his path for all those years. Well, our heart goes out to people when we see them burdened, and when we share those burdens with other people. Well, the phrase that came to my mind was carping is replaced with companionship. I hope you get what I mean by that. So what do we have here? Two motives for Nehemiah, out of reverence for God and out of social compassion. And both of those motives, in whatever style you read Nehemiah, perhaps a robust, confident, perhaps brusque character and style, what you have there are basically the two great commandments fulfilled: loving God and loving one another. Hey, you see, this idea that Jesus came up with wasn't something that he came up with. Actually, it was, in a sense, characteristic of what God expected of his people way, way back. And it's seen here in Nehemiah and in the time of the Persian Empire, that the people were called to love God and love one another. It also anticipates, Nehemiah also anticipates here, the cheerful disregard of one's entitlements. The cheerful disregard of one's entitlements. And that's something that also appears in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Turn, if you could, to the New Testament, to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I want very briefly just to draw your attention to what I think is a quite amazing chapter, where the Apostle Paul's giving a little bit of autobiography, really. He's talking about himself. He's the greatest exponent of the Christian faith, and the most the one who conveyed the message of Christ perhaps most profoundly, and certainly amongst the earliest. And so he would much rather talk about Christ than talk about himself, and only talks about himself in a way that brings glory to Christ, points people to Christ. And in this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he does talk a little bit about himself and about his freedoms and about his rights and the basis of his rights. He's an apostle called by God. He's seen Christ. He's led people to Christ. And in the first few verses of this chapter, let me read these in verse 3. Are you with me? This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? He's demonstrating that he has rights. Rights to hospitality, rights to travel with his family, rights to enjoy financial support. And he explains that in terms of a number of illustrations, like a soldier who's paid for his services. However, even though he has rights, he chooses not to use them. He chooses not to take up his rights, but supply his own needs. And why does he do that? Well, this wonderful little section towards the end of the chapter, draw your attention to verses 19. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I am myself not under the law, as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I have become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Paul, he knew his rights, and he had rights, and he was right, perhaps, to point them out. But he goes a step further than claiming those rights. The step further is to give up those rights for the sake of other people. His longing is that people would come to know Christ, and he gives up his rights for that purpose, which is, I think, the same spirit that Nehemiah demonstrates as he cheerfully gives up some of his entitlements in order to muck in with the work that needs to be done in Jerusalem. Okay, I'm going to stop spotlighting myself and just check. Oh yeah, you're all still there. That's good to know. It can be tricky sometimes when I spend all my time looking at a screen that's not you lot. So to see you lot is reassuring. Okay, are we still good? Are we okay? Everybody's still with us. All right. Okay. So where should we go now? Should we go to chapter 6? Chapter 6 for a few minutes. Let's dig in, because here, well, we revisit something that we've encountered before. Trouble. Yeah, it's not an enjoyable read, I should warn you. Nobody enjoys encountering trouble. If you're anything like me, you're trouble averse, risk averse, you're conflict averse. But it's the experience of life, isn't it? I don't suppose anybody would put their hand up this evening with any honesty and say, I've experienced no trouble in my life whatsoever. Yeah, there we go. Proof. So I'm going to share my screen and see where we are with our outline. Here we go. So there's chapter 5 and chapter 6, ongoing troubles. Verses 1 to 4. I don't know whether ruse is a good word for this, but anyway, I'll read the first 4 verses, and you can decide whether you get what's going on here. Okay, here we go. So chapter 6, 1 to 4. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. Well, it's a great name, isn't it? Ono. I don't know how it's pronounced, but I don't know how you can pronounce it any other way. So there you go, on the plains of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messages to them with this reply: I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. I'll stop sharing my screen because that's a bit irritating. There we go. 4 times Sanballat and Geshem, and names that we're familiar with now, they attempt to meet Nehemiah so that they could, well, maybe distract him from the work, maybe harm him, maybe get rid of him. There is something of a scheming plot. Nehemiah identifies. He says that in verse 2, but they were scheming to harm me. And Nehemiah refuses each time, saying that his work is, well, too important. Or perhaps to soften that a little bit, you could say, hey, I've got a lot of work on my plate at the moment. The in tray is full. The emails are stacking up. I've got a big job on my hands at the moment. However you get the feeling of the sense in which he explains that he's not going to go, he's wise enough to know that it would not have been a good thing to go to the plain of Ono. So this place would have been about 20 miles from the city, which in our day is about half an hour's journey, isn't it? Trouble is, it probably would have taken him out of the city at least a day, 2, probably 3, maybe on average. He would have been away from the work for, let's say, two whole days. Okay, that might have been less than ideal. You know, the foreman disappears, and you all know what happens when the foreman leaves. You know, everybody suddenly goes for a cuppa. I'm sure that wouldn't have been the case, surely not. But actually, it's not just that. It's not just that he would have been absent. He's been invited to go to a dangerous place. He's been invited to a place where there would have been no safety for him, no security, and he could easily have been dealt with, disposed of, got rid of. You know, there could have been probably 101 different ways of people never seeing Nehemiah again if he'd made that journey and gone out to that place. So Sanballat changes his tactics, and verses 5 to 9 we get, well, something I would call slander. Let's read verses 5 to 9, shall we? Then the 5th time Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter in which was written, and I have to admit, I imagined this was the sort of the oh, I don't know, I'm picturing somebody with a threatening letter saying, I'm going to send this to the Times or the Daily Mail or the you know, the South Wales Argus or something like that. I'm going to send it to the editor to publish tomorrow, you know, if you don't. Okay. So, in which was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. This is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let's meet together. In reply to this, I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your own head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. Trying to undermine, trying to blackmail, trying to slander Nehemiah and the people by threatening to publish a letter to send to the king of Persia, King Artaxerxes, that claims that Nehemiah is going to rebel against that king. It would take some courage to brush the whole thing aside, to not want to confront it and deal with it. And in fact, I think verse 9 comes across as something of a a measure of anxiety about the situation. They were all trying to frighten us. But there was a bit I didn't read, wasn't there? Did you spot it? But I prayed. There we go, the end of verse 9. But I prayed. Now strengthen my hands. It's almost as if, yes, it's not easy to brush those things aside, and it wouldn't have been easy for him, and he probably would have weighed it up quite carefully. And he does so by praying. And he's praying that the very thing the opponents were trying to do, which was to cause them to give up out of a sense of weakness and tiredness, he asks God, now strengthen my hands. I bet that's a prayer that you've prayed in one way or another over the years, you know, for the task that you've been involved with, for the project that you want to get completed, or you're struggling to get completed, or the situation that you're going through. It's a great prayer. Now strengthen my hands. And then the next section, because we're not finished with the opposition yet. It continues, believe it or not, verses 10 to 14. One day, I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of, well, that character, who was shut in at his home. He said, "Let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you." But I said, "Should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go." I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Nehemiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So Sanballat's given up on trying to communicate directly. He's given up on sending his own messengers. He decides to hire somebody, to hire a prophet. Prophet for sale, prophet for profit. But this prophet was not a mouthpiece for God or a messenger from God. And Shemaiah tries to persuade Nehemiah to seek refuge inside the temple. Come here into God's house. It'll be a safe place for you. But Nehemiah is not taken in by this scheme. He sees through the scheme to intimidate and discredit him, and he refuses. So let me just share my screen one more time. I'm hoping that you're all still with me. So, oops, I've gone backwards. There we go. So there was a ruse to get them to meet. There was something of a slander, the treachery of using a bought prophet for hire. But then we finish this evening on a note of triumph. There is a sense in which verses 15 to 19 flip everything upside down. Hallelujah. And the ongoing troubles that we've waded through, and it can feel a little bit like wading through treacle when you're going through troubles, can't it? Wading through the troubles have brought us to chapter 6, verse 15. And we rejoice that we've got to this point. So I'm going to read these verses, read them along with me where you are. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 42 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Arah. And his son, Jehonahan, had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. Let's focus on the triumph that there is in this section before we finish this evening. Let me stop sharing. So despite the many obstacles, the Jews complete the wall in 52 days. So the wall was finished. It simply says that. No fanfare. There's what one scholar calls a dryness to this description. You could have sort of, hammed it up a little bit. We've been working towards this. Where you make, get out the cake and celebrate and the balloons. No. It simply said, so the wall was finished. But pleasingly so. The operation was a triumph of concentration over every kind of distraction. I wrote that down. I can't remember where I got it from, but I'm going to see if I can try and remember. The operation was a triumph of concentration over every kind of distraction. I don't know about you, but I am so easily distracted by all manner of things, whether it's, another email that pings in, or a phone call, or a text message. One's literally just pinged through right now. Very tempting to look at it, don't be distracted, concentrate. I can see some of you are smiling, and you suffer that. Well, but anyway, there was a sense of triumph. The Jews, the enemies, had been fearful and had become fearful as a result of this project being completed, because they recognized that it had been completed with the help of our God. That's the testimony. That's their testimony. Where is it there? It's in verse 16. This work has been done with the help of our God. I hope that when you get things done, when you complete things, when you have that moment of, oh yes, and you're quite satisfied. It's so easy to be self-satisfied, isn't it? Look what I achieved, look what I got done, look what I managed to get through, especially if you've had some hurdles or obstacles or difficulties or challenges and you've got there in the end. Our testimony should be, should it not, that this work has been done with the help of our God. That should be on our lips. And that's where we finish this evening. What's the time? Oh, it's getting on for 8:30. It's probably time that we pause to pray, at least for a few minutes or not. I've probably bombarded you a little bit with too much stuff this evening. I hope not, but if it's been a bit too much, then when you wake up tomorrow morning, wake up with the aspiration to read Nehemiah chapter 6. And as you wade through the challenges and the struggles and the difficulties and the troubles that there are, remember that you will get to a point towards the end of the chapter where there is a great triumph. Don't worry, I'll pick up on some of the other verses at the end of chapter 6 next week. But before we go, it would be good to pray this evening, and not least for Mavis in hospital, not least for Tom, for Tom's family, Vina, Helen and Clive, and for Joan's family, Judith and Rod and others. And there might be one or two other people that you would want to pray for this evening. So we are a group of 16 or 17 of us. So I'm not going to suggest we go to breakout groups this evening, but if you'd like to speak out a word of prayer this evening, nice little short prayer so that a number of us can contribute. And don't feel that you're not very articulate. It's not how articulate you are, it's how sincere and honest your prayers are that count. And we shall pray together for a few minutes or so before I wrap it up. Is that okay? Do remember to unmute yourself before you speak out a prayer. And I shall start, if that's okay with you. So let's pray together. Father God, your word is rich in meaning and rich in detail. And there's been a lot of detail this evening. But I pray that through the detail, through the information, there will have been at least something of your voice for us. A voice either of encouragement or of challenge, but your voice to us this evening as you inspire and equip and enable us to be your people in our day. You've called us to this time, this place, this space in history, and I pray that you would equip us for all that you expect of us in these days. And as we come to you now, enable us to draw close to you as we think of others, other people, friends, family, fellowship, and issues across the world. Hear our prayers now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.